Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, the triumph of economic freedom, debunking the 7 great myths of American capitalism. Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon, this is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, today are the myths true about American capitalism. Today, Senator Phil Gramm is my special guest to talk about a great book, The Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism. Senator, it is a pleasure to have you on the program today.
Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be on the program.
You know, I guess the best place to start is inspiration. Every great book has an even greater inspiration attached to it. You know, Senator, what inspired you and your co-author to collaborate on this book? And, you know, it's interesting to publish this book during a very chaotic time.
Well, the book was inspired by my period of service in public office, and in finding that when people differ on the role of government in a free society, it's tempting to say they differ because of the political party they're in. But if you ask them a series of questions about what happened during the Industrial Revolution, did workers get poorer and capitalists get richer, or did everybody get richer? Or if you ask them what caused the Great Depression, or what caused the financial crisis, or was manufacturing hollowed out in post-war America by trade, you're going to find that they have people with very different views, have very different perceptions about how the world works and about what has actually happened during the history of our country. And so what this book does is it tries to look at the 5 historical periods of American history where our most distinct differences exist in our opinions, and then look at 2 contemporary issues, income inequality and poverty, and basically tries to identify what conventional wisdom is, in this case what we call the myth, and then clearly define it, give it its strongest definition, all the facts and figures that are presented in support of it, and then we try to basically debunk the myth. And that's what the book is about.
You know, Senator, I love what you say in the book, that you emphasize a just the facts approach, because a lot of facts are mired in opinions, and they aren't really, a lot of times, not in reality. How important is that we get history and the facts to line up, and what benefits does that create?
Well, you know, the Bible says you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. But it doesn't tell you how you're going to know the truth. And right. For a perfect example it is conventional wisdom. It is taught in every high school textbook of any significance, and in the leading college textbook, that during the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the United States, that industrialists were enriched and workers were impoverished. And of course, we read this interpretation of history from everything from Christmas Carol, the famous novel, to poetry of the Victorian era about how great things were in rural life and how terrible things were when people moved to the cities to work in factories. What we're not told is there's a big difference between what Victorian literature says and in America, progressive era literature says, and what the facts are in both British statistics and American statistics. And when you look at the facts are very clear. There's never been a period in the history of the world where the average well-being of workers improved as much, as fast, as it did during the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, income soared, lifespan exploded, literacy expanded, and by every statistical measure, people were better off in 1900 than they were in 1800 in both the United States and Britain by an extraordinary amount. And yet, progressive literature in America is so preoccupied by the fact that 4,600 millionaires existed in 1896 that they completely turn a blind eye to the fact that 66 million Americans had their well-being grow more rapidly than any people who had ever lived on the face of the earth. It is a typical example of how the history of the Industrial Revolution is completely wrong, totally at variance with the facts.
Senator, in the book you write about economic freedom. How do you define economic freedom, and why is it foundational to American prosperity?
Well, it's foundational because economic freedom is the right of people to make choices for themselves, the right of people to benefit from the sweat of their brow, from their own thrift. And we forget that prior to the Industrial Revolution, especially in England, they're somewhat different in America, but especially in England, you worked based on where you were born and grew up. You worked for the manor house in your area. There was no wage contract. But come the Industrial Revolution, when people started moving into the cities, they entered into contracts for their wages. And the benefits of those wages belonged to them. And the fruits of their thrift belonged to them. And this unleashed a energy which the world had never known. Really, from the fall of the Roman Empire until about the mid-1700s, there was no real economic growth in the world. People lived pretty much like their grandparents had lived. But when we reached a point where, due to the Enlightenment thinking in Northern Europe, people were given the right to worship God as they chose, and the religious wars of Europe ended, when people had the right to think their own thoughts, and that gave rise in places like Britain and America to democracy. And when people owned the fruits of their own labor, they didn't owe those fruits to the king, to some nobleman, to the guild, to the city, to the church. They belonged to them. It unleashed an energy that made the modern world, and it's still making it today.
You talk about 7 myths in the book, and I wanted to go over a couple of them with you. Senator, as you know, the Smoot-Hawley Act, Tariff Act of 1930, was part of a trade war that's, some historians say, helped push America deeper into the Great Depression. The average tariff was somewhere around 20% or so. Are we repeating the same mistakes of our past with this current trade situation?
Well, I think we're in danger of doing it. What we don't know is how serious is the president about these tariffs?
Hmm.
And is this just about negotiation? I wish I believed that were true, but I believe the president is serious about them. And when you stop and think about it, if we had really enforced the 50% tariff on aluminum, when we produce only about 50% of the aluminum we consume in America, and a 50% tariff on steel, and a 50% tariff on copper, which the president has imposed to go into effect at the 1st of August, if that were really put into place, it would totally disrupt the production process in America. And prices would be affected. The competitiveness of American business would be affected. I think it's very dangerous. And there's so much that Trump is doing that I agree with. And the deregulation policy has been very effective. I think his willingness to stand up to woke ideology has been very positive in America. But this protectionism thing, I sometimes fear that the president is like a moth that's attracted to this candle. And it ultimately is going to get too close to it. And we have a long history, Bob. We've had tariffs for 300 years. They were imposed on us by the British. We fought the Revolutionary War in part in opposition to them. Americans have always hated them. We've never tolerated them for long, and they've always been harmful. So with that history, it's not one I want to repeat.
Well, if it wasn't, talk about the Great Depression, if it wasn't the failure of capitalism that created the Great Depression, what, in your opinion, did cause the Great Depression?
Well, first of all, we had a financial panic because we were a rural economy where periodically we had runs on banks in the spring when people were trying to get money to plant crops, and in the fall to harvest crops. And we had set up the Federal Reserve Bank to provide liquidity to end these financial panics. And in 1929, the Federal Reserve Bank stood by in 29, 30, and 31 and watched 1/3 of all the banks in the country go out of business. And then Congress adopted the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which triggered a trade war, and our exports and imports fell by 50%. And then, just as the economy was recovering in the mid-30s, President Roosevelt imposed all of these policies that frightened business. And remember, we were in a world in the 1930s where there was a lot of bad government out there. And people were very fearful about their property rights. And so what happened is people just stopped investing. And when the war, the sort of part of the myth is that the recession ended when the war started. But the war dealt with unemployment, but it didn't deal with the fact that we were still producing fewer consumer goods and that the economy was not growing, except in the defense area. And when the war ended, economists thought we'd go right back into the Depression. But Harry Truman was easier for business to deal with, and then Eisenhower was elected. And by the mid-1950s, the economy had completely recovered, and we've never gone back to a depression, thank God. Yeah. So the Depression was a failure of government, bad policy by the Federal Reserve Bank, bad trade policy, and bad and dangerous policy by the Roosevelt administration.
You know what's interesting is that when you think of the Great Depression, you don't really think about the Federal Reserve Board, and the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. Did they have? I mean, how much of an effect did they have back then? You know, much like they have today. Is it? It couldn't be as much as they have today. I'm assuming.
Well, they had a lot of power, and for one thing, they limited the ability of banks because they basically control the money supply.
Right.
And their job under the Federal Reserve Act was to meet the needs of trade and to provide liquidity to prevent financial crises. But when the crisis came, they didn't provide the liquidity. The money supply collapsed. Prices fell. People couldn't pay off their mortgages. They couldn't pay their debt. And then Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and the economy collapsed. And then in the mid-1930s, you had all of these Roosevelt policies that were really aimed at expanding government and giving government power and vilifying business, and so business people stopped investing. And that's what happened. The lesson of it is not that our market system fails, not that economic freedom fails, but that government failed in the Depression. Now, hopefully, we have learned a lot from that experience. And the Federal Reserve Bank has acknowledged that their policy greatly contributed to the Great Depression, and that they're never going to let it happen again. And I hope that's true. I hope they don't.
You know what's out of all this study and research you did for the book, and I'm a big history buff when it comes to the financial markets. Tell me which one that you talked about in the book was probably your favorite to research?
Well, I liked all of them because they were all different. I think the chapter on income inequality
right.
is an important chapter. First of all, part of our perception of income inequality is that the Census Bureau doesn't count most transfer payments as income and doesn't take taxes into account at all. So, for example, in measuring the income of low-income families, the Census Bureau does not count food stamps. When you get a debit card, you go to the grocery store, you pay for groceries, that's not counted as income. Whereas working people that earn income spend their money to buy groceries. The government buys groceries for low-income people, many of whom are able-bodied, but it doesn't count it as part of their income. It doesn't count Medicaid. It doesn't count refundable tax credits. Now get this. You get a refundable tax credit if you have an income below a certain level, in many cases, whether you work or not. And that check you get from the Treasury, which you can go to the bank in cash, does not count as income. So whereas the Census Bureau says that the bottom 20% of income earners have an income of about $29,000 a year, if you count the value of all these transfer payments, and this is net of the cost of transferring, just what people get, the number's about $65,000. And with the upper 20%, 40% of their income is going to taxes. They don't ever see it. So the Census Bureau says the top 20% has income that's 16.7 times the bottom 20%. But if you take into account taxes and transfer payments, The number's actually 4-1 and not 16-1. We prove that in this chapter in this book.
This is
and now you can say 4-1 is too big. You can say that, and you may believe it, but it's totally different than 16.7-1. And then we show that all these studies by, say, this economist Piketty from France, a big write-up in the Wall Street Journal about a month ago, about 14 rich people. And when you look closely at what Piketty is saying, he doesn't count any government transfers as income to low-income people, even though 88% of the income of the bottom 20% of income recipients is government transfers. He doesn't count any of that as income, and he doesn't take taxes into account for high-income people, that's income lost, and he also estimates what their income would be if they sold their house, cashed out of their retirement, and every year. You remember, Bob, the ProPublica expose where they had the stolen tax returns about 2 years ago? Well, we show in this chapter that apparently with people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, that they used their actual taxes they paid, but they did a bait and switch on their income by making up an income figure, not what their taxable income was, but what Warren Buffett's income would be if he sold every asset he had every year. And so needless to say, Warren Buffett is not paying a very high percentage of that measure of income in taxes. Well, nobody pays taxes on that basis. So it is completely fraudulent. And then Piketty talks about the income of the top 1/10 of 1% of the people. You know, the income of maybe 1,500 people, as if somehow that's relevant. And, you know, Bill Gates is very rich. Elon Musk is very rich. But did they make me poor in getting rich? No. I have a satellite on my house from Elon Musk that's a third as expensive as the system I replaced it by, used it to replace. It's twice as good. Now, I could say to Elon Musk, well, you're rich, but I'm rich too. I mean, I've got that satellite. It makes me a lot better off. So the fact that he got rich making it, great. I'm not offended by that. And today, with a worldwide market out there, you've got a situation where somebody with a new and powerful idea can make vast amounts of money. But the point is, are they taking it away from anybody else? No. A new college graduate makes twice as much money as a high school graduate on average. Now, are they taking the money away from the high school graduate? No. They created it by building their human capital by going to college. Should we resent that? I don't think so. We ought to celebrate it.
Well, Senator Gramm, congratulations on your book, The Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism. It certainly was a pleasure to have you on the program today and enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you. And listen, go on Google and put in Phil Gramm's new book or The Triumph of Economic Freedom. It'll pop up. Read it. You'll realize that our country is even greater than you thought it was.
Well, great to have you on. Senator. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. If you got a question for me, please go to the website, prudentmoney.com, and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.